Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you again for the second day. I've had a wonderful visit in Porto Alegre. We had a very nice dinner last night at the steakhouse. The quantity of food that I ate last night was about what I eat in a normal week. And I don't understand why Brazilians are so skinny, so thin, when the amount of food is so large, but maybe it's a lot of exercise and a lot of walking. My topic for today is the economics of networks and digital technology. This is a fun subject for me to talk about, and it's probably fun for a lot of you to listen to, because we're all interested in network things and digital things, our toys and gadgets, of course. I'm looking at my notes here. This is my notes for the lecture, and we all marvel at these new technologies. We use the internet in so many ways every day. We're hardly even aware of it. Our cellular, our mobile phones and so on. Most of you are on Facebook and MySpace and other social networks, chatting with your friends and so on. We take these phenomena, on the one hand, we often take these phenomena for granted. We don't think about them and analyze them very carefully. We don't apply economic analysis to understanding their nature, their origins, implications for business, for entrepreneurs, for government policy, and so on. Yet, on the other hand, sometimes when commentators, economists, and policy scholars try to think about networks, try to analyze networks and the digital economy, they come to the wrong conclusions. Namely, that a networked economy, a digital economy, is so different from, something else, an old economy, that new rules and new theories and new policies need to be applied. Often claiming, for example, that the government must play a much larger role in regulating, in monitoring, making sure that networks are neutral, making sure that competition is fair, because otherwise the market will fail and the market will not work correctly. And so what I want to do today is to take something of a balanced view and to explain the ways in which, talk about ways in which networks and digital technology make our lives better, make entrepreneurs able to do things they couldn't do before, to explain the role of entrepreneurship in the digital economy, while at the same time puncturing or deflating some myths that are very common in the literature about how digital markets fail, how the market fails in the face of network externalities and first mover advantages and increasing returns and so on. I know that networks and network issues are particularly relevant for you guys in Brazil. When we were at the restaurant the other night, I noticed the telephone pole on the street across from the restaurant, and that's a pretty impressive network. We don't have networks that have that many nodes and that many wires at my home, but I found that pretty impressive. There is a lot of excitement about the new economy, the networked economy, the digital economy in many, many walks of life. What sorts of things do people have in mind? Well, just observing the ways in which people are networked, connected today, and comparing that to things of the past is, of course, extremely important and gets a lot of attention. The internet being the most obvious example, the ways that we are all connected, 24 hours a day by our mobile devices and so on. You can reach almost anyone in the world at almost any time. Some people even enjoy the rare moments when they can be on an airplane, perhaps, and the office can't call, and give you an assignment or something. And of course that is already changing on many flights and will probably soon change on all flights. I don't know, in Brazil, maybe you can go into the rainforest, maybe you can go deep into the heart of the Amazon and you don't have any signal on your wireless device. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are internet hotspots all over the Amazon. But this is something that, if you just think about it, it's a very different way than people have lived in the past. In fact, economists looking at economic development and economic history and the rise of capitalism have often focused on aspects of networks. The economic historian Avner Greif at Stanford University, for example, has argued that it was no coincidence that long-distance trade emerged in the late Middle Ages in the Mediterranean among particular groups of individuals. He's argued, for example, that there was a specific group of Jewish merchants located around the Mediterranean Sea who were among the first to develop reliable mechanisms for long-distance trade. Putting your goods on a ship and sending it off to a faraway port where it may not arrive for several months, and then waiting for payment in specie or other goods received in exchange to return to you many months after that. So there's obviously a high degree of trust that would be required for any merchant to send things a long distance, not knowing whether he'll ever get paid. As you think about our discussion yesterday of entrepreneurship, there's a lot of uncertainty here. And you think no sane person would do that, would exchange anonymously with unknown trading partners at a great distance. But as Greif points out, those who developed these trading mechanisms were not doing it anonymously. They were trading with other people who were within their ethnic, cultural, and religious subgroup. They kept very accurate records of the identities of different traders, their trading behavior in the past. There were strong incentives to develop favorable reputations for honesty and reliability. How many of you have bought or sold something on eBay, or the Brazilian equivalent of eBay, where you trade on an auction site? The reason that eBay works, of course, is because after you trade, you have an opportunity to rate the seller. So if you send some money through PayPal or whatever, and the seller sends you the merchandise and it's no good, it's not what was advertised, or it's poor quality, or maybe they never send you the merchandise, you can type nasty messages in the seller ratings, you can smash them in the seller ratings, and then presumably that will make it harder for them to sell goods to other consumers in the future. So there's a strong reputation mechanism that allows anonymous trade at a distance to take place. Well, hundreds of years ago, before there was something like eBay, there were small, close-knit communities that were geographically distant, yet ethnically and culturally close, and were able to maintain records, archives of people's activities, like the seller ratings in eBay. My point is that modern economic historians have demonstrated that it was the network effect of trade that allowed for the beginnings of the commercial revolution, and then, of course, later the industrial revolution, and so on. So what was very rare and difficult and challenging for our ancestors, in this sense, is very easy for us today. Many commentators have remarked on the role of knowledge, or more generally, intangible resources, as the source of profitability or competitive advantage. So it is said, for instance, in the old economy, the way for a company to be successful was to have lots of physical, tangible resources: land, factories, machines, raw materials. And of course, those are still important today, but you have companies like Google and Facebook, Twitter, and so on, that don't have a lot of physical infrastructure, or at least the physical infrastructure that they have, lots of computers, or what they call server farms, right, are not unique. Anybody can have those. What these companies have is knowledge, information, reputation in the marketplace. In other words, the resources that generate the biggest kinds of competitive advantage, it is said, nowadays are much more likely to be intangible resources. And this, it is said, is sort of marks a fundamental difference between the new economy and the old. I'm sure you've all heard of Moore's Law. Do you know Moore's Law? This is named after Gordon Moore, the semiconductor specialist, not Michael Moore, the documentary filmmaker who makes a lot of silly movies. Moore was the engineer, founder of Intel Semiconductors, who observed that as a rough approximation, not a praxeological law, the computing power of microprocessor chips doubles approximately every year and a half. So approximately every 18 months, the computing power on a processor chip increases by a factor of 2. And this is, of course, remarkable. This is, exponential growth of computing capacity. One of those graphs where you see a line that is not just increasing, but increasing at an increasing rate, exponential growth. And when you study the new economy or the digital economy and you look at the data, you often see many, many pictures that have these exponential growth, the amount of data that you can store on a little tiny micro memory chip of a certain size. And it's not just increasing by 1 gigabyte per year, it's doubling or something like that every year. And we all have this experience, right? Sometimes it's funny that when we think about how much storage capacity we need on our PC or our iPod or our mobile phone, sort of like the number stays the same, but the unit of measure changes. So when I was a young person, much before many of you in the room were born, a really good computer had 64K of memory, right? And then a few years later, a good computer would have 64 megabytes of memory, and now 64 gigabytes, and tomorrow it'll be 64 terabytes or something like that. So it doesn't really matter what the measurement is. You just know that 16 is not enough, and 32 is a pretty good number. 64 is really good. Sometimes you see these graphs with the line going down, right? The cost of a certain amount of computing power, the economic cost, is falling at an increasing rate. The cost of transmitting information from one place to another, falling at an increasing rate. What's called Metcalfe's law, named after another industrial engineer, is the idea that the value of a network, the benefit from being part of a network, is roughly proportional not to the number of nodes, the number of people on the network, but to the square of the number of nodes. Okay, so a network with 4 people is not just twice as good as a network with 2 people, it's more than twice as good. So the larger the number of people on the network, the more valuable the network is by sort of a vastly increasing rate. And of course, we recognize this with our everyday interactions with network technologies. If none of your friends are on Facebook, it's really not much reason to be on Facebook, okay? But if most of your friends are on it, then of course it's worth it for you to be on it as well. And I don't know, whatever networks you guys are part of, social networks and different chat technologies, Skype, Twitter, and so on, the value of being part of these networks is a rapidly increasing function of the number of other people who are also on the network. Okay? We also see in the new digital networked economy new kinds of business or new forms of organization. Not strictly new, as in we've never seen them before, but more of an emphasis or an increased value of particular kinds of organizational forms. For example, ones that are flatter, less hierarchical, more decentralized. Elio gave a very nice talk at the Austrian Scholars Conference last month or a few months ago on the so-called starfish organization. Right, the starfish being an animal that doesn't have a head, it doesn't have a central brain, right? So you can, correct me if I'm wrong, you can cut off one of the arms of the starfish will grow that arm back, and you can cut a starfish in half, certain kinds of starfish, and each half will regrow the other half, and you have two starfish. Okay, so these are organizations that do not have one central node or one central brain through which all the decisions, from which all the key decisions are made. But rather they have a much more loosely organized, decentralized structure. Think, for example, of traditionally designed software, like most proprietary software, with a programming team and a head of the programming team issuing orders for people to do various aspects of the job, compared to a sort of open source community in which many, many people participate without a clear hierarchy, and there's kind of a spontaneous order that emerges rather than a top-down, hierarchically planned order. It turns out this distinction is often exaggerated. So it is not true that hierarchy has completely disappeared or that hierarchy is unimportant in any organization. That's an overstatement. That's a myth. But yet we do seem to see more kinds of decentralized organizations and larger ones and more important ones, an increased emphasis on looser rather than tighter structures. This is also a characteristic of the new networked economy. Now, of course, there are also broader implications beyond just the economic ones, right? Why is all this important? Why do people care about this so much? Well, purely from an economic perspective, right, the rise of electronic commerce, facilitated by the internet, by the personal computer, by cellular, mobile networks and so on, right, has certainly opened new markets for different kinds of transactions. You can buy things on your mobile phone, you can shop for goods and services on the internet, you can watch your video, you can bypass the cable company, the television networks by getting your video on your PC or your iPhone or whatever. So there's a lot of money to be made by creating new goods and services, new means of exchange through e-commerce networks, both for consumers and for businesses, so-called business-to-business electronic commerce. Mobile technology, network technology, digital technology is not only created by entrepreneurs, but also provides an environment in which yet more entrepreneurship can flourish. And if we're interested in strong economic performance and economic growth, we cannot help but marvel at the role that digital technology and network technology can potentially play in improving economic conditions. But of course, it's not just economic issues, it's also cultural and social issues, right? The revolution in Egypt is, people call it the Facebook revolution. Okay, so if we are to believe the news accounts that we've read, people are organizing, specific protest movements and marches and so on using Facebook and Twitter and text messaging, etc. And it's very difficult for the central authorities in places like Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen and even Libya, right, to block popular demonstrations and protests when the state cannot control the flow of information. So, for us as libertarians, as Austrian economists, as individuals interested in bringing about social change towards liberty and against statism, right? We have an amazing set of tools at our disposal that our ancestors could only dream about and probably couldn't have dreamed about. I've been involved in Austrian economics and the libertarian movement for, 25 years. And I enjoy meeting people of all ages at conferences like this, making new friends, and asking, well, how did you get into all this? Perhaps you've had the same experience. How did you hear about Mises Brazil? How did you even know who Mises was? How did you find this conference? How did you find these books? How did you discover these ideas? And everyone's story is a little different, of course. But, long ago, when I was young, and even before that, people were much more likely to learn these ideas from another person, from a teacher, from a professor, maybe from a parent, or maybe occasionally from a fellow student. But the size of the Austro-libertarian network, if you like, was pretty small. Most scholars working in Austrian economics were isolated. They were scattered about, one at this university and one at this university. And you meet many Austrian economists who will say, well, I thought I was the only one in my country. And I was shocked to discover there was one more. Okay? Now most of you probably found these ideas through the internet. Right? You were interested in something, you were Google searching, you were browsing, you were playing around, and you found out the ideas and the names, and you met other people and so on. Right? So the rapid growth of the Austro-libertarian movement, I haven't actually collected the data and plotted a chart, but I imagine it would look something like Moore's Law. Okay? That Austrianism is growing at a rapid pace, an increasingly rapid pace, because we can communicate with each other. We can share ideas. Look at the amount of books and articles, from the newest ones to the classics, that one can get online, typically for free. Look at the lectures that are available. Just using YouTube and websites like Mises Brazil and Mises.org and so on, one can get practically a PhD in Austrian economics without ever leaving one's home. You can be converted to full-fledged Austrianism in your pajamas, something that never would have been possible for previous generations. Okay, many people I've met here in Brazil, and many more young people I meet in the U.S. learned about Austrian economics through Ron Paul. They were part of the Ron Paul movement, and from reading and listening and so on, they discovered Mises and Rothbard, Hayek, etc. Ron Paul, the success that Ron Paul has had in the U.S. is often attributed to his or his team or his followers' clever and creative use of the internet and network technologies. Ron Paul has raised a huge amount of money on the internet, much more relative to the total amount raised than most of his mainstream conventional rivals. Now, I should say that Obama and his supporters were also quite good at using the internet. But among the Republican candidates, Ron Paul was by far the most successful in getting publicity and even raising money through networks, through the internet, through decentralized means. So this is something very important for culture, for society. Now, of course, there are critics as well. There are people who worry that we spend too much time on our computers, too much time with our earbuds in our ears, and we don't socialize with each other the way we used to. The Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam wrote an influential book, I guess it's been about 10 years ago now, called Bowling Alone. Maybe you've seen this book, Bowling Alone. And he complained that Americans were not as involved in civic organizations, social clubs, community groups, in part because they spent too much time watching television, too much time playing video games, too much time surfing the web. People sometimes, people of my generation or older complain that when young people get together to listen to music, it doesn't mean you sit in your friend's apartment and put the music on the speakers. It means everybody exchanges MP3s from device to device, and then you all put your earbuds in. You sit in the same room, each person listening to his own music. This is a different way of sharing than the way we shared when I was a kid. A recent book called Alone Together, it just came out last year, explores this in some detail. A social critic worrying that we spend a lot of time networked through technology, but it's not the same kind of network as personal, face-to-face interaction. So this is something that critics and commentators are certainly thinking about. Now, one downside, as I suggested before, is that some people do say crazy things. There are some crazy ideas out there about networks and technology. A book that came out in 1998 by a journalist who writes also for Wired magazine named Kevin Kelly provides many examples of what I consider to be outlandish, uninformed, and quite silly claims about how the world is completely different. He says things like this: in the information age, consumers quickly came to count on drastically superior quality for less price over time. Well, that's true. That part is true. But then he says things like, the price and quality curves diverge so dramatically that it sometimes seems as if the better something is, the cheaper it will cost. And what he means in the context of this discussion is that those silly economists with their demand curves and supply curves arguing that when something is better, it will have a higher price, that these economists must be wrong. And we must throw away economic theory because now the demand curve, maybe it doesn't slope down. Now it slopes up. Or maybe, who knows what kind of, maybe it's a circle or it's some kind of weird or funny shape. We can no longer use basic economic theory to explain prices. Well, I mean, look, the point here is simply that over time, with improvements in technology, often costs will go down, right? So a PC you can buy today not only has a lower price, but also is much higher quality than a PC that you would buy 10 years ago. But that is not a violation of the law of demand as formulated, for example, by Carl Menger, which states that other things equal, when at a lower price, a higher quantity will be sold, or the greater the willingness of buyers to buy because they value the product higher, the higher the market or equilibrium price. So Kelly is confusing if you think of this in supply and demand terms, those of you economics students, he's confusing movements of curves over time with traveling along a given curve at a moment in time. Right? So demand curves still slope down. Moore's law does not invalidate the law of demand. Okay? A report from the Dallas Fed around the same time. So late 90s, before the internet bubble burst, is when you tended to see the most of these sort of silly claims. Here's another one. Scarcity, the first assumption of the old economy, isn't the dominant feature of the new economy. Now remember, what economists mean by scarcity, what Austrian economics means by scarcity, Professor Hoppe discussed this in his lecture yesterday afternoon, right, is the fact that human beings employ means that are scarce to achieve the ends that they desire. So human action always involves the use of scarce means. We cannot achieve all of the ends that we seek to achieve, so we must consider alternatives, trade-offs at the margin. We face opportunity costs of using resources for one activity as opposed to another. We cannot always have everything that we want. We have to make sacrifices. In other words, we have to economize. That's something that you learn on the first day of any economics course, Austrian or otherwise, maybe not Keynesian, but any decent economics course. It doesn't mean that we're poor or something like that, right? So what they say, scarcity isn't the dominant feature of the new economy. Many of today's markets are awash with goods and services. Okay. Sellers compete aggressively for buyers. Fine. They discount, they cut costs, they expand markets through relentless promotion and advertising. Like this never happened before 1990? Sellers didn't compete aggressively with each other in prior decades or centuries. They didn't cut costs. Has he heard of Standard Oil or Andrew Carnegie or any of the great entrepreneurs of the past? More of today's companies and industries thrive on quantity discounts. The higher the demand, the lower the price. That's another one of these statements that if read, if you're careful when you read it, you think, oh, well, I guess, the law of demand, we can throw it out the window now. Okay? The higher the demand, the lower the price. Well, of course, this just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Okay, this is just hype or exaggeration or excitement, carried to ridiculous extremes. Now, if we think about it carefully, first thing we realize is that what appears to be new may be more important. On the margin, it may be more significant. But what appears to be new is not always new. Right? As we read in the book of Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. Well, there are some new things, right? There are new ideas. There are new products and services. But new phenomena are not always as new as they appear. So, it's true that anybody can have a blog, anybody can have a web page, anybody can sign up, can have a Twitter account. So, in an important sense, the cost of publishing has gone down thanks to the new technology, right? But it isn't the case that people never had means of communication at low cost before. If you read the history of the American Revolution, people like Thomas Paine, for example, people were writing small documents against the king, against the authorities, and they were distributing them in little, I don't know if the words would translate, but pamphlets, or sometimes they were called handbills, a little piece of paper that you could distribute. You could print many copies, and you could secretly distribute them sort of in an underground fashion. So it isn't the case that until 10 years ago, the only way to get ideas to a large number of people was to have a big publishing house. And now you don't need that anymore. Well, that's an exaggeration, right? Notwithstanding everything that is remarkable about the internet, we have had communications networks in the past. The telegraph is a good example. The telegraph emerged in the 18th and early 19th century. Some of the earliest telegraphs were visual telegraph systems involving multiple nodes with flags or some other kinds of signals, and then each node would have a glass where you could see the other and you could transmit messages back and forth. The electric telegraph, of course, coming along later. It's very interesting. There's a book called The Victorian Internet by a journalist named Tom Standage that is all about the history of the telegraph. It's quite fascinating stuff because right around the time that the telegraph, the electric telegraph, began to be used widely, journalists and scholars began writing books and articles that sound exactly like, with quotations just like the two I showed you, saying, everything is different now. We have a new economy because we have instant communication across the globe. Demand curves will not slope down anymore. We don't have scarcity anymore. All of society will change. And of course, it didn't change in as radical a way as they were thinking. In fact, there were even sort of like the equivalent of listservs, and there was texting language that was invented by, the Victorian telegraph operators were doing the 19th century equivalent of LOL and BRB and this sort of thing. The culture was very much the same as it is now. It's true that we have directories of information, repositories of information on web pages, but people have been buying and selling information for hundreds of years. The telephone book is a directory. It isn't as good as an online directory. It's harder to update. It doesn't have as much information. It's more difficult to send from person to person, but it essentially performs the same function. What about the rapid adoption of new technology? Right, so Facebook, I don't know exactly when Facebook first came online. I think somebody showed it to me around 2008, maybe? 2009, I thought it looked stupid, and I think I signed up for an account, but never looked at it again. And then all of a sudden, everybody was using it. People often remark that these kinds of technologies, they diffuse throughout the economy very rapidly. It doesn't take long for a company like Facebook or Twitter to go from completely unknown, no one's ever heard of it, to the thing that everybody's talking about and has millions of users and can get huge amounts of private equity from Goldman Sachs and this sort of stuff. That also is not really new. Some of you, if you've taken a course in the theory of innovation, you've probably seen a picture like this one with the curve. They call it an S curve. It looks like the letter S. There was a guy named Rogers, a technology scholar named Rogers, who described this relationship. They sometimes call it the Rogers curve. And it's meant, so on the horizontal axis is time, and on the vertical axis is the number of users. And the idea is to show that new technologies, when they're introduced, in the beginning, only a few people will use them, so-called early adopters. But then all of a sudden, it will reach a point where the rate of adoption increases very fast. And you have this almost vertical section of the curve, and then it flattens out, where almost everybody who's ever going to use it is already using it. It's like Facebook, right? Just like I described, nobody had it, then all of a sudden everybody had it, and you probably know a few people who are not on Facebook, maybe your grandmother, and she's probably not going to ever get it, okay? But if you look at the history of other kinds of technology, the adoption rate often follows the same pattern. It's true for electricity, automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, telephones, video recorders. Almost all forms of new technology for the past 100, 150 years or more have also been adopted at more or less with the same pattern. So again, this is nothing that's completely new. There's a very interesting book by a Yale University law professor named Benkler called The Wealth of Networks, play on Adam Smith's title, The Wealth of Nations, where he describes, he calls it commons-based peer production. He means things like Wikipedia, open source software, right, where many, many people in a community, online community, can participate without kind of central ownership, without central direction. He describes it as a more kind of democratic means of producing products like Wikipedia or Linux or something, a more democratic way of producing goods and services that's better than a hierarchical, more exclusive way. Benkler is coming from the left and arguing in favor of participatory democracy and this sort of thing. But he makes the startling claim that, peer-to-peer networks and open source networks and so on, this is the first time that many, many thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals have been able to participate in producing things, each adding a small incremental contribution, leading to an end result that is much more than what any one individual could have produced. And, I want to send this guy a copy of Leonard Read's little essay, iPencil. Do you know iPencil? Right? Well, what he describes as the features that he ascribes to commons-based peer production are exactly how we would characterize the free market. Right? The market is a giant network in which people participate by buying and selling. They contribute to overall social market orders, prices, quantities, the allocation of resources, and so on. So when people say, well, the internet or Wikipedia or open source software is a kind of spontaneous order, we might respond, yes, indeed they are, just as the market is a kind of spontaneous order that has been around, since the beginning of human civilization. Okay? I've already gotten the 5-minute signal, and that was probably 6 minutes ago. A few points that I will not cover in my remaining -1 minute. The idea that so-called information goods are really not fundamentally new. They're economic goods. They have prices. They trade in markets just like any other economic good. So-called network externalities are, again, they get sort of overplayed in the literature. People claim that whenever there are these so-called network externalities, where the value of using a particular technology depends on the number of others also using it, that this leads to a kind of market failure, where arbitrary technologies end up dominating, like Facebook, for example, even when other competing technologies are really better. Some excellent work by 2 economists named Stan Leibowitz and Stephen Margolis have shown both theoretically and empirically that the markets can handle so-called network externalities very well, and that markets actually do a pretty good job of selecting the right technologies, even in the face of so-called path dependence. So to conclude, by skipping one more slide, the internet has, of course, had a huge impact on education, on culture, on the economy, on society at large. There are many interesting and unusual characteristics of this sector, which imply maybe different ways of doing business. First mover advantages are particularly strong. Sometimes companies will find it profitable to give some things away, right? Like Skype. Anybody can download and install Skype for free. Does that mean that the makers of Skype, a Danish company, that they're altruists, that they're not entrepreneurs interested in making money? No, of course not. But they have other ways of making money by charging for complementary products and services, such as technical support, calling to phones, certain kinds of premium features. So companies often give some things away for free to increase the number of users, what they call installed base, so that they can therefore make more money charging for other services to this installed base. Information goods and network effects are important, but not really all that new. And the basic lesson that I want you to take away from this is that the basic laws of economics that you can read from Karl Menger or Ludwig von Mises or Murray Rothbard, they're still good. Okay, Mises didn't write about the internet, it's true, but the principles of understanding human interaction, of understanding market competition, pricing, buying and selling, and so on, that one finds in works like Human Action, are just as important and valuable today as they were in the so-called old economy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bom, vamos ao debate então, à conversa, né? Alguém gostaria de começar? A gente, por favor. Let's see.
Bom dia, meu nome é Caio. Só uma curiosidade, em um dos slides você mencionou a falácia do Nirvana, Nirvana Fallacy. Você poderia falar mais sobre o que seria isso? Fiquei curioso.
Like to know a little bit about Nirvana fancy that you mentioned previously.
Yes. So what they call the Nirvana fallacy, the economist Harold Demsetz is the one who coined the term, is the idea of looking at kind of imagining a perfect situation, a paradise, comparing a real-world outcome to that paradise, finding, not surprisingly, that it isn't as good, and concluding, therefore, that the market failed. So, for example, in the history of technology, many critics will say, well, what's a good example? So, let's say there's Facebook and MySpace, two competing social network platforms, or at least they were competing until recently. And some critics, journalists, engineers will say, well, Facebook sort of ended up dominating, but the other one, MySpace, was really better. It was a better technology, but because Facebook had better advertising, or because Facebook had a little bit of a head start, that it ended up there was a snowball effect, like a snowball rolling down the hill, and all of a sudden it took over and it dominated. And gee, wouldn't it have been better if the other technology had won out? Most people here are too young to remember one of the classic examples is with videotapes. So 20 years ago or more, there were two different formats for video cassette tapes. So-called VHS, the one that became the dominant technology, and another one called Betamax, made by Sony. VHS beat Sony in the marketplace, but many critics of the market have said Betamax was really better. Just like this literature, they often use the term QWERTY. So that, the typewriter keyboard, in English it's QWERTY. I don't know how it is in Brazil. So the layout of the typewriter keyboard, it is said, is inefficient. It would really have been better if the market had adopted a different layout. We could all type faster and make fewer mistakes. But QWERTY won out, and now we're stuck with QWERTY. It's too hard to change. Once a particular technology has become the standard, it's very difficult to break out of it. What the literature has shown is that, sometimes we look back in history and we say, gee, wouldn't it have been nice if things had happened differently from the way they did? And that might make for interesting nostalgia, but that isn't a policy-relevant issue unless it can be shown that an alternative political mechanism, i.e. the state chooses the standard, would have worked better. So what critics like Paul David, the historian Paul David, have in mind is that the government should choose the standards. The government should say, well, which is better, Facebook or MySpace? It's this one, and you should use it. Betamax is really better than VHS. Blu-ray is not the best. It's this other one, HD DVD is how they marketed it in North America. Well, look, would we expect state planners to make better choices of what technology will in the future turn out to be the right one? To believe that the state could do this, to believe that government planners could do better than the market, is to commit the so-called nirvana fallacy.
Well, if I can make a question, talking about the future trend, of course, could you point us a possible future trend inside the walls of internet, if it's possible to do?
Well, gee, that's not an easy question to answer. I mean, look, one way I can respond to your question without really answering it is to point out that, I think Austrian economists tend to be a little bit wiser, maybe, or more circumspect than other economists in attempting to predict the future. Or rather, one way to answer is, well, if I knew the answer to that question, I certainly wouldn't tell all of you. I'd be out investing in anticipation of making a lot of money. So, being an economist or an analyst is different from being an entrepreneur. But, look, my best guess would be not much different from what other people who follow technology trends are estimating, right? It seems that from what the scientists tell us, they keep saying that Moore's law is going to stop. Eventually you're going to run up against some physical restrictions. You can't make a computer smaller than one atom, okay? But we seem to be a long way away from reaching that limit. There continue to be new scientific breakthroughs, so-called quantum computing and so on. So Moore's law seems still to be going strong. Commentators tell us, experts tell us that sort of decentralized artificial intelligence algorithms will continue to be more important. So artificial intelligence has not been very successful in doing what people thought it would do back in the 1940s or 50s, that we could program a machine to be a super intelligent computer. However, if you have many, many hundreds or thousands or millions of small computers, each of which is not very smart, but in the aggregate, they can perform, incredibly well. So even just some of the, when you go to Amazon.com and it says, hey, Peter, you might like this book. Based on books that you bought in the past, we predict that you might like this one. Those prediction technologies continue to get better. Maybe you use a streaming audio music service like Pandora. I use Pandora, and as you're listening to a song, you can click thumbs up or thumbs down, and it tries to form a model of your musical taste. Right? Now, no one could write down a computer program to model a human being's musical taste, but sort of incrementally through trial and error, using large amounts of data, these very sort of inductive rather than deductive algorithms seem to be getting better at doing that. So I would expect that kind of limited artificial intelligence, limited robotics, robots that aren't very smart but can vacuum. They already have little robot vacuum cleaners, right? This kind of limited intelligence that can do good things by being networked on the internet would become more important. But I really don't have any special insight. I just read the same things that you guys all read.
Ok. Por favor, tem uma pergunta ali em cima.
Hello. What's your take on net neutrality, and what do you think this business practice might spread to other countries?
It's a very good question, so-called net neutrality. And does everyone know what that means? The idea that the government should impose some kind of restrictions on what network providers can do. So for example, people want to make it illegal for your ISP, the company that provides the network access to your home, to block certain kinds of content or to favor one newspaper over another, let's say, or one television channel over another, or to let certain kinds of information go through faster and make other kinds of information have a slower access to the network. It is argued that this is unfair, that it's anti-competitive, that the network infrastructure should be treated like a public good or a public utility. It should be regulated so that every content provider, every website, every television station, every information provider should have equal access, so-called level playing field. I mean, once you put it that way, it doesn't sound all that good, right? So I'm not sympathetic to so-called network neutrality. Of course, the problem is that most of the ISPs are either state-owned or state-regulated. So the ideal system, from my point of view, would be one in which all parts of the network are private. So, websites are private, television stations are private, mobile communication networks are privately owned, wires that go in the air, under the ground, to your home are privately owned. And it would be up to market participants to decide which kinds of content they prefer, how they want to bundle or package things, what sort of prices they want to use. Just to give you one example, many of the major newspapers in the US, the New York Times, for instance, is a strong advocate of so-called net neutrality. They say it is not right that a cable company can favor one newspaper over another. But yet, if I write an article and submit it to the New York Times, do I have just as much of a chance that they'll publish it as if Paul Krugman writes an article and sends it to the New York Times? No, the New York Times is not a neutral platform. They discriminate. They favor Paul Krugman over Peter Klein, which of course is a tragedy. It's a very unwise move. But the New York Times is not a neutral platform. A television station is not a neutral platform. A website is not a neutral platform. It doesn't even make any sense, because bandwidth, network access, like any other good or service, is scarce. It must be allocated among competing uses and users, and allowing the price mechanism to perform this task is by far the best means of allocating that scarce resource.
Nós temos outro participante aqui.
Hi, my name is Gabriel, and I would like to know, because I think that we are living in a bubble, in a internet bubble. It's for me, it's like the dot-com bubble, because we have now new companies that many billions of value, as you know, Google and Facebook, but their revenue is just about advertisement. It's not real economy, just advertisement. What do you think about that? Do you believe that we are living in a bubble because of we have an economy that is superaquecida?
I have a similar question here.
Yes, I think I understand.
Vou falar em português, depois traduzir. Gostaria de saber seu ponto de vista em relação ao valor das marcas versus faturamento de empresas como Facebook, Google, Twitter. Qual o fundamento dessas empresas valerem 60 milhões de dólares, 200 milhões? So it's the same point always. He likes to know if you agree with this high amount of value that these figures.
Well, I certainly agree with you that we look at many internet companies that have very high market valuations and pretty small revenue streams or fairly narrow revenue streams, right? So Google actually does have a lot of revenues, but as the first questioner points out, they come almost exclusively through one channel, through an advertising channel. Companies like Twitter and Facebook have much smaller revenues, but yet very high sort of market valuations. And this is, of course, exactly what we saw during the dot-com bubble of the 90s. Very high ratios of market value to real earnings. Now, so does that mean that we're in a bubble now? Well, first of all, bubbles are very difficult to identify at the time. We sort of only know ex post, right? So, market participants are willing to pay pretty high prices to get shares of Google. And we might look at it and say, well, it doesn't seem like that can really be justified in terms of the expected stream of future dividends and capital gains. But it's not easy to say that the market is making a mistake in this sense. Now, keep in mind that the dot-com bubble in the US was, in my interpretation, at least partly fueled by credit expansion. It was partly an Alan Greenspan bubble, right? So the Austrian theory of the business cycle, about which we've heard some already and which we'll hear more about this afternoon, I believe, it describes a specific mechanism through which credit expansion distorts the economy's capital structure. lengthens the structure of production, leads to misallocations of resources, malinvestments. But the theory does not say exactly how the malinvestments will appear in a given historical case, right? So in the bubble that we've just now gone through, the malinvestments appeared in real estate, in land values and home prices and the prices of certain kinds of securities and so on. In the 1920s, the bubble manifested itself in stocks and in other parts of the economy. And at least part of the dot-com bubble, I think, reflects a credit-fueled central bank bubble, which combined with specific technological improvements and a lot of excitement and hype, led to some of the malinvestment being channeled into technology stocks. Now, the asset bubbles that we think we're seeing now in commodities and real estate and so on, as central banks have responded to the last crash by doing exactly the same thing over again, namely increasing the amount of credit expansion, increasing the rate of credit expansion as a response to the problems caused by their previous credit expansion. It's possible that some of that may also manifest itself in technology stocks, but it's not easy to say at the time.